and welcome to your lecture on Cyrus the Great and the End of Exile. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. No empire rules forever, and the balance of power can shift in the blink of an eye. The Assyrians, they of the army boots and the cruelty and the relocation, had ruled the Near East for centuries when the Babylonians rose up and in 609 BC took the Assyrian territory for their own. But the Babylonians did not rebel by themselves. They had help, and their help came in large part from the Median Empire. The Median Empire was a large empire to the east of what would become the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And within the Median Empire, there was a small area known as Persia. The Persians were vassals of the Medes. In other words, they remained more or less their own nation, but they had to obey whatever the ruler of the Median Empire wanted them to do. And this situation continued until 550 BC, when a man named Cyrus the Great fulfilled his grandfather's nightmare. There are many legends surrounding the birth of Cyrus the Great. The one that the Greek historian Herodotus thought the most likely, and therefore the one that he wrote down, has Cyrus as the son of a Median princess and a Persian vassal. While Cyrus was still in the womb, his grandfather, the Median king Astyages, had a terrible nightmare. In this nightmare, a vine grew out of his daughter and curled itself around his empire, around the Median Empire. And when Astyages went to his dream interpreters to ask them the meaning of this dream, they told him it meant that one day his grandson would usurp him. In other words, one day his grandson would take the throne from him. Now, Astyages liked his throne. He enjoyed having power, and he was not at all fond of the idea of his grandson taking it from him. Therefore, he tried and failed to have the baby Cyrus killed. He tried to murder his own grandson. But as I said, he failed, and as a result, Cyrus ended up as the leader of the Persians. Cyrus's father, the Persian vassal, had been a peaceful and unambitious man, content to be leader of the Persians and vassal to the Median Empire. But Cyrus the Great was not his father. Cyrus the Great led a successful revolt against his grandfather Astyages and declared himself king of both the Medes and the Persians. After all, as son of a Median princess, he had right to kingship over the Medes. As son of a Persian vassal, he was the natural leader of the Persians, and both sides supported him, not only because he was a great leader, although he was, but also because both sides hated King Astyages for his cruel tyranny and were glad to be rid of him. Cyrus proved himself an able general, and between 550 and 539 BC, a span of only 11 years, he managed to conquer pretty much all of the Middle East, including Lydia and Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was now part of the ever-spreading Persian Empire. Having conquered the Middle East, however, Cyrus the Great now had to hold it. This, of course, is the problem that all rulers of all empires throughout history have had to solve. How, once you've conquered a nation, do you keep it from rebelling? The Assyrians, if you remember, used a mixture of cruelty and relocation to achieve this end and keep their empire together. Cyrus the Great took a very different approach. He managed to use a carefully crafted cocktail of fear, tolerance, and personality to win the love of his subjects while simultaneously making them terrified to rebel. The first component of Cyrus the Great's successful anti-rebelling policy was fear. He wanted people to be so afraid to rebel that they wouldn't even try, that they wouldn't even talk about it. He could have gone the Assyrian cruelty route, but he chose not to. Instead, he decided to make every person in his empire a spy. Cyrus the Great's eyes and ears were everywhere. It was said people were encouraged to spy on one another and to report any signs of disloyalty, kind of the North Korea approach. The Greek historian Xenophon writes, "There are many ears of the king and many eyes, and people are everywhere afraid to say what is not advantageous to the king, just as if he were listening, and afraid to do what is not advantageous, just as if he were present." Cyrus the Great knew that fear alone would not be enough to keep his subjects from rebelling, however. They needed to not just fear him, they needed to love him as well and to be genuinely loyal. One of the ways in which he earned their love and achieved their loyalty was through a policy of tolerance. Remember, up until this point, whenever a nation was conquered by another nation, they had to convert to that new nation's faith. They had to worship their gods and follow their customs and become peoples of that new nation. That was the whole point behind the Assyrian relocation policy, to make people forget where they had come from and become Assyrian. But that is not the approach that Cyrus the Great took. He did not force people to become Persian. Instead, he encouraged them to live and worship however they liked, as long as they remained loyal to him. It was the first time that an empire had been run this way, and it earned people's gratitude and their loyalty and their love. Not only that, but it made things easier for Cyrus as well. After all, by leaving local governments and systems intact, it kept everything running smoothly without Cyrus needing to micromanage every single tiny part of his empire. As long as the system was working in an area and they weren't rebelling, they could just keep doing what they were doing. And so this enabled him to rule this enormous empire pretty easily from afar. The final component, and one of the most effective to Cyrus's anti-rebellion policy, was the sheer force of his personality. He used himself to knit his empire together so that people were loyal not so much to the idea of the Persians, but to the idea of Cyrus. Specifically, Cyrus the Great used gifts, mercy, and propaganda to portray himself as a generous, benevolent, and divinely appointed leader. Who else, by the magnitude of his gifts, wrote the Greek writer Xenophon, has made people prefer him to their fathers, to their brothers, and to their children? Cyrus was merciful to the people he conquered and even to the leaders of those people. He spared the lives of his enemies when he could, including the life of his grandfather, that cruel Astyages, whom he did not kill but instead kept imprisoned for the rest of his life. And of course, there's propaganda, that use of biased ideas or information to make the public think or act in a certain way. Other rulers we've studied have been very good at using propaganda effectively. Think King Hammurabi, with that picture on the top of the law code of him receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash. Think Ramses the Great sailing down the Nile as if he were bringing the floodwaters, or erecting 69-foot tall statues of himself at Abu Simbel, or showing himself single-handedly crushing the Hittites. When it came to propaganda, Cyrus the Great was no slouch either. And this on your screen is the most famous example of propaganda during his reign. It is called the Cyrus cylinder, and it was created when he invaded and conquered Babylon in 539 BC. The Cyrus cylinder is a clay cylinder written in cuneiform that states that Cyrus the Great is not conquering Babylon. He's liberating it from the previous ruler. And not only is he liberating it, not only is he doing Babylon a favor by invading it and taking it over, but he is doing so with the divine blessing of the Babylonians' main god, Marduk. And the Babylonians bought it. Cyrus the Great's policy of religious tolerance, his widespread expansion of the Persian Empire, and his legendary generosity had a profound effect upon the history of a small but very important people who had had their temple destroyed, had been driven from their homeland, and were currently living as exiles in the city of Babylon. I speak, of course, of the Jews. When Cyrus the Great liberated Babylon in 539 BC, he freed the Jews. He freed those exiles. He gave the Israelites permission to return home and rebuild their temple. Not only that, but he offered to pay for it. He returned the treasures of the temple that the Babylonians had looted. Cyrus the Great's generosity enabled the Israelites to go home, to rebuild their temple, and to begin the next chapter of their history. Next week, we'll look at the next chapter in another nation's history as we head over to Greece and explore one of their most important turning points, the Greco-Persian Wars. See you next week.